What is up, my friend? Welcome back to the basement. I am Mikey Henninger, and this is Basement Brewed Fantasy Football. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for tuning in to what I think is the best dang fantasy football show in Franklin, Wisconsin. Hands down, I don't think it's close. This is episode 10 of the Basement Brewed Fantasy Football podcast. Kind of feels like a little mini milestone. Today we are going to wrap up the AFC West of our team-by-team fantasy football previews. So if you haven't tuned in quite yet, you've missed all the other episodes, no worries. Back episodes 2 through 5, I piloted this summer series where I'm going through all 32 NFL teams, and I'm previewing them, forecasting every single fantasy football relevant player on all 32 teams. So episodes 2 through 5 covered the AFC East. We've already done the Bills, we've done the Dolphins, the Jets, the Patriots. Episodes 7 through 9, we headed out west, and we've already covered the Chargers, the Raiders, the Chiefs. So here we are in episode 10, and today we're going to wrap up the AFC West with none other than the Denver Broncos, who I think might be the most fascinating team in the NFL from a 2022 fantasy football standpoint. Now, before we dive in, as always, there is a link in the description of this podcast to an article that I've already written and I've already published. That article is usually going to be a heck of a lot more detailed, a heck of a lot more in-depth than even we get into this episode today. So I highly recommend going to check that article out. Again, the link is right in the description, or you can even just go to basementbrewedff.com, click on free content, and bam, it should be the first thing that you see. Last but not least, before we dive in, you are going to hear me make mention of my fantasy football draft kits. Okay, these are something I created for myself, but I do now make available to anybody who plays fantasy football that wants to dominate their draft. There's 3 things in particular that make my draft kits different than anything else that's out there. Rankings, projections, magazines, whatever. Number 1, there is going to be strategy and philosophy for every fantasy football relevant or big fantasy football position. Quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end. That is built and based off of me already doing 200 plus fantasy drafts this summer, and it's built off of that. It's using very real data, very real landscape. It's based off of 200 plus drafts. Number 2, as you're drafting, you're going to be in rounds 5, 6, 7, 8, and you're going to find roster construction tips that help you navigate your way through the draft and build a championship team based on what you've already done to this point. Third, and finally, and most importantly, every single fantasy football player in the NFL, in the 2022 landscape, is going to have their own individual thorough written analysis forecasting what to expect from them in 2022. We're talking over 250, we're talking over 300 players that all have their own write-up. Okay, so you're going to hear me make mention of those draft kits several times today. By the way, the draft kits until the end of July, until August 1st, they're $10. $10. You have spent $10 on much worse. Buy a homeboy a beer. I'll forever appreciate it, and I think you'll enjoy it as well. So, all right, let's dive into this thing. The Denver Broncos, I mentioned that I think they might be the most fascinating football team in 2022 fantasy football. They went from a fantasy wasteland, basically, to a fantasy goldmine seemingly overnight. 2 specific big changes that took place, and you've heard of both of them, but let's talk about them because they're significant from a fantasy football standpoint. First and foremost, they hired Nathaniel Hackett as their new head coach. Prior to this, he spent 8 seasons as an offensive coordinator. He spent 2 years with the Buffalo Bills, and then 3 years with the Jaguars, and then 3 years with the Green Bay Packers. Now, in his time as an offensive coordinator, he's run mostly balanced offenses. He does have a history that indicates that he's capable and willing and wanting to tailor his offense according to his players and where he feels like the strengths are. If you look at his historical trends, there's nothing in his history or on his resume that indicates, oh, this is a run-heavy coach, this is a pass-heavy coach. He's been mostly balanced, but he does seem to structure the offense around the strength of his players that make up that offense. Speaking of which, that other big change that the Denver Broncos made, and I know you've heard of this at this point, blockbuster trade in the offseason, they brought in Russell Wilson. Now, Russ himself is going from a coaching staff that wouldn't quite let him cook, right? In the last 4 years with the Seattle Seahawks, Russell Wilson's Seahawks have finished 31st, 17th, 23rd, and dead last in passing attempts. They had a quarterback like Russell Wilson, but they just wouldn't let the guy throw the ball. So he's coming from that offense, and he's going to a coaching staff that it's already being said. There's already offseason reports indicating that the Broncos are tailoring their offense to Russell Wilson, which, chef's kiss, that's exactly what you want. In football, in fantasy football, anybody who loves watching football, they want to see Russ do the dang thing. Now, it's not just Russell Wilson that this impacts, obviously. Of course it's not. It's also going to impact pretty much everybody on the offense, especially his position players. So you think about last year's Broncos trio of wide receivers. There's no shortage of talent. There's Jeudy, Courtland Sutton, Tim Patrick. They do have KJ Hamler, who was out all year last year with a hip and ACL injury, but there's no shortage of talent in that wide receiver room. However, last year they finished wide receiver 83, 44, and 45. And even if you want to look at averages, you want to look at PPR points per game, then they finished wide receiver 64, 61, and 59. Okay. Meanwhile, so we know that there's a heck of a lot of talent in that room that's severely underperforming based on, circumstances probably on their control at quarterback. Meanwhile, Russell Wilson's Seahawks, who we already don't throw the ball very much. They didn't throw the ball very much. They threw less than Denver did last year, but they still produced a wide receiver 14 campaign from DK Metcalf and a wide receiver 23 campaign from Tyler Lockett. Not to mention, two top 33 wide receivers in each of the last 3 years. Not to mention a, dominant wide receiver 7 and a wide receiver 8 campaign in 2020, just 2 years ago. Further than that, dating back to 2015, Russell Wilson's wide receiver 1, now whether or not that's Jeudy or Courtland Sutton, but we'll get into that. Russell Wilson's wide receiver 1 dating back to 2015 has finished 14th, 7th, 13th, 24th, 13th, 8th, and 7th in fantasy football, and none of those teams finished in even the top 15 of pass attempts. So yeah, Russell Wilson's, importance and the significance and the impact that he's going to have on being added to this offense, it cannot be overstated. I am all in on Denver from a fantasy football standpoint. I am all in on Jeudy, Courtland Sutton. I have way too much of them. I'm overweight on them already. In fact, if you look at my best ball shares up to this point, Jeudy is easily my highest rostered player, and I'm at a point where I have to force myself to not draft him so that I'm not overweight and an injury will kill me. Anyway, let's dive into Russell Wilson specifically. Let's start with the quarterback. Now, we mentioned that they didn't throw the ball much, right? He's finished on offenses that have finished 31st, 17th, 23rd, and dead last in passing attempts in the last 4 years. He has managed finishes of QB 9, QB 3, QB 6, and QB 13. Okay, so they didn't let him throw the ball, and he still was top 3, top 6, top 9, top 13 in 4 straight years. He has hit 20 or more fantasy points in 45.9% of his games in the last 4 years. For comparison, or to put it in perspective for you, Josh Allen has done so at 50% of his games. So he's about pacing with Josh Allen on 20-plus point games. He has hit 30-plus point games in just 8.2% of his games, which isn't a lot, but to put it in perspective, he is pacing with Aaron Rodgers, who's done it in 7.94% of his games in the last 4 years. Now he's going to get a more aggressive coaching staff. He's going to get a similarly talented offense with Jeudy, Courtland Sutton, Tim Patrick, KJ Hamler, Albert O, Javonte, we're going to get into Javonte Williams in a minute. He's just got an incredibly talented offense plus a more aggressive head coach. They're going to let him cook. In fantasy drafts so far here in 2022, Russell Wilson is currently the QB 9. He's going around pick 84, which is the end of the 7th round. Usually he's being drafted within 6 spots, either before or after him are Tony Pollard, DeAndre Hopkins, Juju Smith-Schuster, Rashad Penny, Devontae Smith, Elijah Moore, Dallas Goedert, Tom Brady, Rashad Bateman, Tyler Lockett, Aaron Rodgers, Ken Walker, and Chase Edmonds. Now, in drafts where I've already taken both Jerry Jeudy and Courtland Sutton, and believe me, I've done it a ton, then Russell Wilson is an auto draft for me in the 7th. I want that stack. I have so much Russell Wilson, Courtland Sutton, Jerry Jeudy stacks. It's not even fair. It's probably not even healthy. Easily my favorite stack in 2022. That said, even when I don't have Courtland Sutton or Jerry Jeudy, I'm more than fine taking Russell Wilson as a standalone QB1, even without that stack. Depending, of course, on if I need a QB1 or if I've taken somebody to this point. If I have taken a QB1, typically I'm also looking at Tony Pollard, DeAndre Hopkins, Juju Smith-Schuster, Rashad Bateman, Tyler Lockett, Chase Edmonds, in that range, as well as maybe Tom Brady or Rodgers if I still need a quarterback. Now, as for those draft kits that I mentioned, again, $10 for the rest of July, probably some of the best value you can possibly find in the fantasy football space. I'm very, very high on Russell Wilson. I have him in tier 1B with Lamar Jackson, Kyler Murray, and Joe Burrow. So that should help you understand how high I am on Russell Wilson here in 2022. In dynasty leagues, I can't help but wonder if, in my opinion, his redraft ADP is too low, indicating that the public is likely lower on Russell Wilson than I am. So in my opinion, that possibly creates a buying window, a buying opportunity for Russell Wilson in dynasty leagues. It can't hurt to contact the manager who rosters Russell Wilson in your dynasty leagues and just see if there's any potential to make a maneuver. Typically, I'm not a guy who's trading for quarterbacks in 1 QB leagues, but his ADP is so low that I feel like the public is they're sleeping too much, to put it one way. All right, let's hop into the backfield with Javonte Williams and Melvin Gordon as if it wasn't crowded enough. So Javonte Williams gave fantasy football managers a taste of what it would be like to have Javonte Williams as a workhorse back in week 13 of last year. Melvin Gordon missed that game. Javonte Williams went on to get 29 touches. He had 6 catches on 9 targets. Okay, so 29 touches, 178 scrimmage yards, and 1 touchdown. He scored 29.8 PPR points in one game where Melvin Gordon was not active. So it left fantasy managers drooling, wondering what it could be, and it made him look like a really pretty first-round draft pick here in 2022. And then Melvin Gordon re-signed with the Broncos, which was always a possibility, but the more time passed, it looked like Melvin was going to be playing somewhere else. But alas, here we are. July 25th, Melvin Gordon is back with the Denver Broncos, and it's very, very likely that both running backs are going to be heavily involved again in 2022, which is great from a football standpoint, but from a fantasy football standpoint, it certainly convolutes things and makes things tricky to figure out and try to predict. Now, last year, they split time pretty dang near evenly. Most weeks they were low-end RB2s, high-end RB3s, or just completely useless altogether. Now, Javonte Williams, he did out-touch Melvin Gordon, but barely. It was a 14-touch difference in Javonte Williams' favor, whereas Melvin Gordon out-touchdowned, boom, I just made that a new word. Melvin Gordon scored 9 touchdowns to Javonte Williams' 7 touchdowns. Both guys did eclipse 1,000 scrimmage yards, okay? So there's some very real juice left in the tank for Melvin and some juice to see from Javonte. Javonte Williams averaged 12.28 PPR points per game to finish as RB23, and Melvin averaged 11.9 PPR points per game to finish as RB26. Neither guy was particularly safe as a weekly fantasy football option. Javonte Williams finished under 10 PPR points in 43.8% of his games, and Melvin did the same in 46.7% of his games. Now, you do have to think, okay, well, there's a whole new coaching staff in town. That's obviously going to change things a little bit. Nathaniel Hackett's history here, by the way, I dove into all eight of his seasons as an offensive coordinator, and it's not super telling in terms of what to expect. On the one hand, there is evidence of him embracing a workhorse type of idea. In 2017, he got a shiny new toy in rookie Leonard Fournette in Jacksonville. Fournette went on to get 70% of the top 2 running backs in Jacksonville touches. So he got 70% of the top 2 running back touches in 2017. Aaron Jones got the 66% of the top 2 running back touches in 2019. So there's some evidence there of a workhorse philosophy. But on the other hand, he has also embraced a running back by committee approach. Fred Jackson and CJ Spiller, way back in 2013, his first season as an offensive coordinator, they had a near even split. There was only a few touches that separated the two of those guys, and you might be saying, well, yeah, that's way back in 2013. That, it's significantly different now. You can't even use data from back then, and I totally agree with you. But last year, 2021, Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon had just 2 total touches that separated the two of them. In fact, I didn't even realize off the top of my head that A.J. Dillon had more carries than Aaron Jones had. Okay, so I went back and I analyzed all 8 seasons of Nathaniel Hackett as an offensive coordinator just to try and get a feel for how he uses his running backs, and spoiler alert, his wide receivers as well. And you can find a lot more details in the written article. Again, the one that I linked in the description of this episode, but the TLDR, too long didn't read for all you boomers out there. When Nathaniel Hackett has my summation of his last 8 years as an offensive coordinator, when Nathaniel Hackett has 2 capable running backs, 2 running backs that deserve to be on the field and ought to be on the field, much like Javonte and Melvin Gordon, he's likely to keep both involved, allowing neither one to really hit their season-long ceiling. On average, and again, keep in mind this is an average that can be skewed, but just keep in mind that on average, Hackett's RB1 seems to get 59% of the top 2 touches, and the RB2 gets about 41% of the top 2 touches. And that's probably the maximum spread here between Javonte Williams and Melvin Gordon. I'd be betting on more of a 55 to 45 type of split between the two guys. Ultimately, I just don't think the Broncos bring back Melvin Gordon if they intend to ride Javonte Williams as a workhorse. That's just not that's unlikely after they made the move to bring back Melvin Gordon. Now, for what it's worth, I did look at Las Vegas lines, the over-unders. They do not have any lines yet on Melvin Gordon, so there's no data to be had there. But Javonte Williams is pegged in Vegas sportsbooks for about 1,250 scrimmage yards, 945 of which would be rushing, and then 7 rushing touchdowns. Now, that's 167 fantasy points, not including catches, not including receiving touchdowns. So to add a little bit of math here and try and get more realistic numbers, if he is supposed to get 1,250 scrimmage yards and 945 of those are supposed to be rushing yards, that means we need 305 receiving yards from Javonte Williams to meet those numbers. He did just about that on 41 catches last year. So if we add Javonte's 41 catches last year, suddenly we're sitting at 208 PPR points, not including receiving touchdowns, and suddenly we're sitting at RB11 last year if we're using last year's numbers. Okay? Current fantasy football drafts. Speaking of RB11, that's exactly where Javonte Williams is currently drafted. He's the RB11, the 11th running back off the board. He's drafted around pick 19, which is in the second round. We know without any doubt in our minds whatsoever, we know Javonte Williams has league-winning, league-altering upside if Melvin were to disappear, but he's already being drafted like it. Melvin didn't disappear. Melvin's still there. So he's currently being drafted near the names DeAndre Swift, Travis Kelce, CeeDee Lamb, Deebo Samuel, Nick Chubb, Alvin Kamara, Tyreek Hill, Aaron Jones, Leonard Fournette, Mark Andrews, Saquon Barkley, Josh Allen, and Mike Evans. For me, when I'm on the clock in that range, I'm usually looking at DeAndre Swift, Travis Kelce, CeeDee Lamb, Aaron Jones, Mark Andrews, Saquon Barkley, and Mike Evans. I'm usually not even looking at Javonte Williams. I've sprinkled him in here and there just to make sure I have exposure in the portfolio, but frankly, Javonte Williams is mostly on my do not draft list more than he is on my draft list, just based on the fact that it's hard to get behind a guy who's who's likely to get 55% of the team's touches. And for that same reason, I'm actually starting to move down on Aaron Jones as well. Now, Melvin Gordon, he is currently the 36th running back off the board, around pick 98, which is in the 9th round. He's drafted around names like Drake London, Zach Ertz, Dawson Knox, Robert Woods, Ramondre Stevenson, Brandon Ayuk, Treylon Burks, Michael Carter, and Christian Kirk. Melvin Gordon is easily one of my favorite selections of that batch of guys that I just read off, especially if I've embraced a zero, hero, or superhero RB build where, by this point, if I have 0, 1, or 2 running backs, then typically I like scooping up Melvin Gordon as a third or sometimes even second running back, depending on how my build's gone. But I don't want to count on him as a second running back. I like him much more as a third or even fourth running back. If I'm already feeling strong at running back, then instead of Melvin Gordon, I will opt for guys like Robert Woods, Brandon Ayuk, or even depending on how my tight end room looks, Dawson Knox or Zach Ertz. And to be clear, guys, in no way, here I am saying, I'm not drafting Javonte Williams, but I'm all over Melvin Gordon. In no way am I saying Melvin Gordon is better than Javonte Williams. That's it's not even close. Javonte Williams is going to outscore Melvin Gordon, health pending. All I'm saying is that for the price, for the value of where they're being drafted in 2022 fantasy leagues, Melvin Gordon is a value pick, and Javonte Williams is already being drafted as a ceiling pick, if you will. Now, injuries change things, and one of those guys can explode through the roof if the other guy disappears, but we can't assume injury. Now, in my $10 for a few more days draft kits, I have Javonte Williams in tier 2A with David Montgomery, Ezekiel Elliott, and James Conner. And I have Melvin Gordon in tier 2C with Kareem Hunt, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Elijah Mitchell, Damian Harris, A.J. Dillon, and Tony Pollard. In dynasty leagues, probably not, but maybe there is a purchase window. There's a purchase opportunity to go get Javonte Williams if the current manager is depressed that Melvin Gordon is returning. I know that there was a huge sigh of depression when it was announced that Melvin Gordon would be returning. There was a huge depression sigh in Twitter, in fantasy Twitter world. So it can't hurt, of course, to contact the dynasty manager who rosters Javonte Williams and just see how they're feeling about 2022, and maybe it's a purchasing opportunity for you, but probably not. All right, let's head over to the Broncos wide receiver rooms. And this is where, the running back room is fascinating as all get up, but the wide receiver room is really, it's really polarizing. It's going to make things really interesting as people are making their decisions here in 2022. Now, it's been hell for the guys in the last 2 years in the Denver Broncos receiver room. Last year, Courtland Sutton was the wide receiver 42. Tim Patrick was the wide receiver 44, and Jerry Jeudy was the wide receiver 84. Courtland Sutton scored under 10 points in 75% of his games. Tim Patrick never hit 20 PPR points. Jerry Jeudy never even hit 15. Not a single one of those guys last year was able to average even just 9.4 PPR points per game. And the year before that, none of them were better than wide receiver 44. So it's been hell for these guys over the last 2 seasons, but now we got Chef Russell Wilson in the kitchen, and this unit is suddenly one of the most fascinating in football. So there's pros and cons when looking at the history. I told you earlier in this episode that I looked at Nathaniel Hackett's 8 years as an offensive coordinator, and I also looked at what Russell Wilson has done for wide receivers in the last several years as well. And there's pros and cons when looking at the history. So starting with the cons, right? We want to save the best for last. So when you look at Nathaniel Hackett's track record for producing fantasy assets at wide receiver, it's not great. Point blank, full stop, I think the kids say. It's not great. So in 8 seasons as an offensive coordinator, Nathaniel Hackett's wide receiver 1 has finished as the 53rd, 27th, 24th, 40th, 33rd, 23rd, and then first and second best wide receivers in fantasy football. As you can probably guess, the first and second were Davante Adams with Aaron Rodgers, which how much of that can we really credit to Nathaniel Hackett? He deserves some credit, of course, but I mean, you also have to put an asterisk there knowing that it's Davante Adams and Aaron Rodgers. But other than that, wide receiver ones finished 53, 27, 24, 40, 33, and 23. As for wide receiver twos, those were, I mean, obviously they're worse. They're wide receiver twos, but those finished 59th, 45th, 42nd, 48th, 56th, 67th, 55th, and 56th. And the wide receiver threes, let's not even bother. None of them finished better than wide receiver 67. So the track record up to this point, it doesn't look good for wide receiver ones. It doesn't look good for wide receiver twos, but let's add a little bit of context here. So for starters, Nathaniel Hackett's wide receiver ones to this point have been Stevie Johnson, Sammy Watkins, Allen Robinson, Marquise Lee, Dede Westbrook, and Davante Adams. His wide receiver twos have been Robert Woods, Marquise Lee, Keelan Cole, Dante Moncrief, Alan Lazard, and Marquez Valdez-Scantling. And the quarterbacks that he had before Aaron Rodgers were E.J. Manuel, Kyle Orton, and Blake Bortles. So the guys never, ever really had a full, complete puzzle of quarterback, wide receiver one, wide receiver two. He's had nothing even near as sexy as a bundle of Russell Wilson, Courtland Sutton, Jerry Jeudy. He's had nothing even close to that, right? He's had Rodgers and he's had Davante Adams, but then it's MVS or Lazard. And he had, or he had Stevie Johnson and Sammy Watkins, which is kind of nice, but then it was E.J. Manuel at quarterback. He's just never had the trio, the bundle of a stud quarterback, stud wide receiver one, stud wide receiver two. Okay. Now for the pros. So remember when I told you that Russ is coming from one of the most run heavy teams in football over the last several years? That did not stop him from producing more than one wide receiver in fantasy football. So for example, I think we already talked about this, but last year, Russell Wilson's Seahawks had the second fewest passing attempts in all of football, yet DK Metcalf finished as wide receiver 14 and Tyler Lockett was wide receiver 23. The year before that, the Seahawks were 17th in passing attempts, but they had a wide receiver 7 and a wide receiver 8 campaign in Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf. So 2 top 8 wide receivers in 2020. The year before that, which was DK Metcalf's rookie year, he finished as wide receiver 33, which is tough to do as a rookie, regardless of where you are and who you're playing with. And then Tyler Lockett finished as a wide receiver 13. So 3 straight years, Russell Wilson had 2 wide receivers in the top 33. And in the last 2 years, he's had 2 wide receivers in the top 23. He also had a wide receiver 7 in Doug Baldwin in 2015 and a wide receiver 8 in Doug Baldwin in 2016. You get the idea. Russ gets his guys points, and not just one. He's capable of supporting at least 2 wide receivers. It remains to be seen what can be done if he's in a more pass-heavy offense than he's ever been in. Now, let's take a look at what Vegas is expecting from these wide receivers. Now, there's nothing, there's no lines for Tim Patrick. There's no lines for KJ Hamler. Jerry Jeudy is, the over-unders for Jerry Jeudy sit around 72 catches, 905 yards, and 6 touchdowns. That would be about 198 PPR points, which last year would have made him the wide receiver 28. Fascinating enough, every single one of those Vegas lines, those Vegas numbers, is better and higher than what they're expecting from Courtland Sutton. But as we'll get to in a minute, Courtland Sutton is actually drafted later. Courtland Sutton is drafted earlier than Jerry Jeudy in fantasy drafts so far here in 2020. Now, Courtland Sutton, I told you that Jeudy is supposed to hit 72 catches, 905 yards, and 6 touchdowns. Sutton is 62 catches, 900 yards, and 5 touchdowns, which is about 182 PPR points, which would have been the wide receiver 30 last year. I like both of these guys to hit almost all of their overs. Here's why. Russell Wilson in 3 straight seasons, his last 3 seasons, both his wide receiver 1 and his wide receiver 2 have hit at least, both of them have hit at least 58 catches, 900 yards, and 6 touchdowns. Now, again, in the article that I already wrote, it's in the description of this podcast, In that article, I detailed out each of the last 3 seasons, so you can go look and see clear as day what Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf did specifically in each of the last 3 seasons. But if you take a look at that, you're going to realize that these over-unders, all of these over-unders, are more than doable. I like both guys to hit their over-unders on all of them. Meanwhile, Tim Patrick, KJ Hamler, those are high upside double-digit round picks, especially Tim Patrick. The guy somehow he just keeps finding a way. He keeps ending up the wide receiver 2 in Denver, and he's definitely likely to have some useful games here in 2022. They're probably going to be unpredictable, but he's going to be on the fantasy football radar, especially when bye weeks start to roll around. And then KJ Hamler, he's off the radar. He's not somebody you can actually spend a draft pick on, but he is somebody to have on your watch list as a former, second round pick in Denver. As for 2022 fantasy drafts, currently Courtland Sutton is the first Broncos wide receiver to be taken off the board. He goes around wide receiver 24, around pick 62, which is in the 6th round. Jerry Jeudy doesn't go too far after that. Jeudy is the wide receiver 26, picked around pick 65, which is also in the 6th round. Now, the names surrounding these guys are Brandon Cooks, Marquise Brown, Chris Godwin, Joe Burrow, Amari Cooper, A.J. Dillon, Darnell Mooney, Kyler Murray, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Dalton Schultz, Miles Sanders, T.J. Hockenson, Damian Harris, Allen Robinson, Jalen Hurts, Michael Thomas, and Adam Thielen. To put this as simply as possible, I want both Jerry Jeudy and Courtland Sutton over all of those guys. Every single one of them. And there's plenty in there that I like. I'm looking at this list again. Brandon Cooks, Amari Cooper, Miles Sanders, Allen Robinson, Adam Thielen. I have Michael Thomas. I have a lot of these guys, but I want Jerry Jeudy and Courtland Sutton over all of them. As for Tim Patrick, he's being drafted as the wide receiver 63 around pick 168, which is in the 14th round. That includes names like Jameson Williams, Mecole Hardman, Darrell Williams, Jamal Williams, lots of Williams up in here. The Colts defense, we got defenses involved. Matt Ryan, Jahan Dotson, Albert O, DJ Chark, 49ers D, Rams D, Rondale Moore, Gus Edwards, Matt Gay, David Njoku, Chargers D, and Robert Tonyan. And to put this one as simply as possible, I want Tim Patrick over all of those guys not named Rondale Moore. Rondale Moore I would take over Tim Patrick 10 out of 10 times, but Tim Patrick should not be as cheap, as free as he is in fantasy football drafts. I'd be delighted to get him in the 14th round more often than not. Already talked about this, but KJ Hamler, you can ignore him in fantasy football drafts. He's worth a flyer, a 20th round flyer in best ball drafts, but in redraft, you can ignore him, but keep him on your watch list as a former second round pick in a high octane offense. In my draft kits, I have Jerry Jeudy and Courtland Sutton both in tier 2A with Terry McLaurin, DJ Moore, Deontay Johnson, and DK Metcalf. I have Tim Patrick in tier 4B with Kenny Galladay, Kadarius Toney, Chris Olave, Corey Davis, Marquez Valdez-Scantling, and more. And then KJ Hamler I have in tier 5B with AJ Green, Zay Jones, Terrace Marshall, and some other names. Again, those draft kits, they're just $10, the best value in fantasy football, at least for the next week. You will not be disappointed if you consider it. All right. Oh, real quickly on Dynasty Leagues. Now, Jerry Jeudy and Courtland Sutton, those guys are obviously exciting holds. Maybe there's an opportunity to make a buy low offer since their redraft ADP is so low. KJ Hamler, that's a guy who's still just 23 and kind of forgotten about in fantasy football because of last year's hip and ACL injuries. Jerry Judy's a possible free agent next season. I think KJ Hamler's worth floating out a really late rookie pick to see if you can just grab him from the current dynasty manager who's got KJ Hamler and just stash him on the bench, see what happens. All right, let's wrap this thing up with the tight ends, and it's a little bit more interesting than I thought it would be. So, I suppose at some point I should try and pronounce this name. So, here we go. Albert Okwuegbunam. I think that was not bad, but from here on out, he will be known as Albert O. So, we're going to talk about Albert O and their rookie Greg Dulcich. Now, Russell Wilson's acquisition, part of that sent Noah Fant packing. It sent him to the Seattle Seahawks. He's continued to be locked in with Drew Lock. Get it? He's locked in purgatory. I think that's 3 for my last 3 episodes, fitting in a dad joke on the fly. That was awesome. But when Noah Fant moved over to Seattle, that moved automatically by default. That moved Albert O to the top of the depth chart among Broncos tight ends. But then they used their 3rd-round pick on UCLA's Greg Dulcich. Now, usually rookie tight ends don't make much noise in year 1, or even year 2 for that matter. But it is noteworthy, at least, if nothing else, that Greg Dulcich has been getting first-team reps in spring OTAs and in minicamp. So while that doesn't necessarily change the likelihood that, Greg Dulcich probably isn't a fantasy factor in year 1, it does make you wonder and give you a little bit of pause about Albert O as a legitimate fantasy asset, because it makes you wonder if he's as locked in as the starting tight end as maybe we thought he was. And now I think there's doubt, and it's peeling me off of Albert O as a fantasy option in 2022 fantasy football. Beyond all of that, it's fair to wonder how valuable the TE1 role is anyway in Denver with Russell Wilson and with Nathaniel Hackett, especially with a already loaded wide receiver room and a not so promising history of tight end results from both Russell Wilson and Nathaniel Hackett. Again, in the article that I wrote, in the article that the link is in the description of this podcast, I broke down some very, very specific details that I won't cover here in this episode because it'll just be too confusing to try and talk through. But if you see it with the naked eye, you'll see what I'm talking about. The TLDR, in 17 combined seasons at quarterback and offensive coordinator between Russell Wilson and Nathaniel Hackett, 17 combined season, Russ and Hackett have combined to produce a top 15 tight end just 3 times. That's it. And Jimmy Graham was in that mix twice. And we can't assume that Albert O or Greg Dulcich is Jimmy Graham. So I think the history of Seattle Hackett and Russell Wilson not really producing tight ends in their history, plus an already loaded wide receiver room, plus some camp battle that's going on between Albert O and Greg Dulcich, it's really peeling me off of both guys as legitimate options in 2022. Now, in fantasy drafts, Albert O is currently the 17th tight end off the board around pick 168, which is in the 14th round. He is being drafted around names like Jameson Williams, Mecole Hardman, Darrell Williams, Jamal Williams. We're back in the Williams room. The Colts defense, Matt Ryan, Jahan Dotson, DJ Chark, Tim Patrick. 49ers defense, Rams defense, Rondale Moore, Gus Edwards, Matt Gay, David Njoku, Chargers defense, and Robert Tonyan. I think Albert O is fine in that range. It's not like he's expensive, but personally I wouldn't bother spending a pick on him in redraft leagues. Typically my philosophy with redraft is I either want an elite tight end or I just don't even draft one. I just play the waiver wire all season. In best ball leagues, I'm fine with Albert O as a tight end 3. In my draft kits, I have Albert O in tier 2B mixed in with Cole Kmet, Tyler Higbee, Irv Smith, David Njoku, and more. And then I do have Greg Dulcich in there in tier 3B with O.J. Howard, Foster Moreau, Jonnu Smith, and some other guys. In dynasty leagues, Albert O is just 24. Dulcich is just 22. That makes both guys intriguing in dynasty leagues, especially if one guy can emerge as the surefire, bona fide tight end 1 for years to come with Russell Wilson. As for Greg Dulcich in rookie drafts, I'd be looking at him somewhere in the mid to late 3rd round of rookie drafts. All right, that's a wrap on the Denver Broncos. That is a wrap on the AFC West. Again, there is a lot more information and even more detail in the article that's in the link in the description below, or just type in basementbrewedff.com, click on free content, and you'll see the Broncos blue and orange right in front of you right away. You can also find everybody in the AFC East, the Dolphins, the Jets, the Patriots, the Bills. You can find the rest of the West with the Raiders, the Chargers, the Chiefs. It's all in there. It's all on basementbrewedff.com. So yeah, please use the link in the description. And if you don't want to miss anything further, right, we've covered, 8 teams, which means we have, 24 teams left to go. If you don't want to miss future teams as I publish those articles, be sure to sign up for the email list. It doesn't cost anything. It's completely free. You'll automatically get notified every time I put the new team preview out there. So I'll put that link in the description as well. And then if you're out on Twitter, that's where I do most of my fantasy football hanging out. So come hang out with me over there. I'm at BBFF, so Basement Brewed Fantasy Football, at BBFF Mikey on Twitter. And remember, those draft kits, $10 for the rest of July until August 1st. You will not find a better value in all of fantasy football. I promise you that. These things are worth at least $25, but you can have them for $10. The season pass also, by the way, that's a $75 product that I'm selling for $40 until August 1st. So check it out. DM me on Twitter with any questions. Shoot me an email with any questions. That's it for today. Next, I will be back. We're actually going to head out back east. We're going to hop into the NFC East, and we are going to get started with none other than the Dallas Cowboys. So I'll look forward to talking to you then. Thanks so much for tuning in once again. Cheers. This brew's for you.